Getting an all-around improvement on your F-150's suspension as well as an extra 2 inches of front ride height doesn't have to cost you an arm and a leg, and our dear friends over at Eibach Suspension are here to prove it with their Pro Truck Sport Complete Shock and Strut Kit. This awesome overhaul of your F-150's suspension system comes with a pair of front Eibach Pro Truck Sport struts that have 0 to 2 inches of ride height adjustability using built-in perch settings, as well as a pair of Pro Truck Sport shocks that can handle up to an additional inch of rear lift so that you can get some extra ride height from a rear block or add-a-leaf kit without overstretching your factory shocks. Jack up the truck and remove the wheels for access to the front suspension. You can first remove the dust cap and unbolt the axle from the front hub assembly. The tie rod end can now be unbolted and removed from the knuckle. Hit the knuckle with a hammer if the tie rod is stuck inside the knuckle. Remove the upper control arm from the top of the knuckle, but leave the bolt threaded on a few turns until we are ready to remove the knuckle. Depending on your year F-150, now remove either one or both bolts on the lower shock mount. On the side of the knuckle we have a few brake line brackets that we need to unbolt to create enough slack to move the knuckle. Remove them from the side of the knuckle as well as the frames seen here. Behind the knuckle by the axle is the vacuum line which can be pulled off for now. Now we're ready to break loose the knuckle from the upper control arm. A few blows with a hammer will do it. A trick we have learned to make this job easier is to loosen the UCA mounts just a bit to take the tension off the control arm, which makes the knuckle removal and reinstallation much easier. A few push pins hold up the dust shield and they can be removed for access to the top shock mounts. Now with access we can unbolt the 3 bolts on the top of the struts. We are ready to pull the coil over, so remove the upper control arm and prop it up to make room. The knuckle can be set aside. You will most likely need to remove the sway bar to drop the lower control arm enough to pull the coil over. We used a pry bar on the lower control arm and were able to squeeze out the coilover assembly. Use a spring compressor to take the load off the top coilover mount. This will enable you to remove the top nut on the cap. It is important to keep the spring and cap in line with the lower shock mount since they are side specific. Mark the alignment for ease of installation later. The spring and bump stop can be removed from the stock shock, then knock off the lower spring perch with a hammer. We then placed our Eibach shock into the vise and selected our height adjustment. Now for a very important note. If you are reusing the factory spring, you can choose any height setting on the Eibach shock. But if you are installing the Eibach spring replacement, you must use the lower spring perch setting since the new Eibach coil will lift the front end of the truck for you. If you max out the setting on the shock with the new coil, your ride quality will greatly suffer. Once you have determined your desired lift setting and installed the collar and perch, give the spring perch a couple taps with a hammer to help seat it in place. Since we are using the Eibach spring, we removed the spring compressor from the factory springs and compressed the new Eibach springs. We highly recommend using a wall mount spring compressor for these new taller springs. We did have some difficulty compressing the new springs enough to install them on the shock. Slide on your bump stop to the Eibach shock, then the new spring. The factory cap will set on top of the spring, and then you can tighten the upper shock nut. The spring is now secured and the compressor can be removed. You can see our completed coilover assemblies here, and how we have used the lowest spring perch setting with the Eibach spring. The coilover can be slid back into the truck, and for now, we will hand tighten the upper 3 nuts. Align the lower mount and slide in the 2 lower control arm bolts and hand tighten them as well. We can then bring up the knuckle and seat the axle into its place, followed by attaching the upper control arm to the top mount in the knuckle. Tighten up the axle nut, but be careful not to over-tighten as you can risk snapping the axle. Then replace the dust cover. Begin torquing down the upper control arm to the knuckle, then work your way to the shock mounts in the lower control arm. Since we are finished moving the upper control arm, the frame mounts can be tightened back down. Lastly, on the coilover, the top 3 nuts are ready to be tightened as well. Insert the tie rod end back into the knuckle and tighten it down. Moving our way over to the brake lines, they can all be replaced into the knuckle as well as the bracket up in the frame. Tighten the sway bar back to the end link, then you can finish up the install by clipping in all of the wire looms to the frame and the dust cover back on top of the wheel well. Moving back to the rear shocks, support the rear end with a jack stand and remove both lower and upper mounting bolts to be able to pull the shock from the truck. We found it easiest to insert the lower mount into the truck first, then compress the body of the shock and slide it into the upper mount. Once both mounts are in, you can tighten down the factory hardware and complete the shock installation. At their full 2 inches of ride height, the struts allow for the clearance of up to 33-inch tall tires for a great look and extra ground clearance for off-road applications. The struts themselves feature a performance-oriented monotube design with a 46mm piston that provides much improved compression and response over the factory struts, while reducing body roll and instability on the road.